May 3, 1847, Savannah, Georgia. The room chosen for the sittings had the kind of hush-money buys, thick curtains that smothered the street's opinions, carpets fat enough to make footsteps think twice, a tall mirror made to flatter. The small brass bell on the painted table near the window rang once, then stilled, and the house learned to hold its breath the way houses do when a secret sets up a chair and asks to be seen only from certain angles. If haunted Southern history keeps the pulse steady and the lamp turned low, tap subscribe and ring the bell. This canvas has a ledger of names, and the varnish remembers all of them. Drop the town you grew up in. Some frames move with a name. He signed the visitor's book in a hand that brought Paris to mind even if the furthest he'd ever been was Baltimore. Lucien Favreau, portraitist. The ink sat blue and respectable on the parlor page while the household evaluated him the way Savannah evaluates rain. Will it cool or ruin? He carried a mahogany case with the right scuffs in the right places and a portfolio bound in cord. He kept his hat in both hands the first 5 minutes, a modesty the master of the house enjoyed. Annabeth Colfax, Annabeth only if you had earned it, stood where he asked with the chair drawn half to window light, half to shadow. The sash was tied too tight at her waist, and the lace itched, but was not allowed to say so. 18 and born to summer, sitting on a balcony fanning the evening flies into submission, she had a spine like a drawn line and a mouth trained to knowledge men pretended not to notice. Her mother, Eugenia Colfax, kept near, correcting posture with a breath, the way a woman does when correction has been her inheritance longer than pearls. He set his things on a table and opened the case as if unlocking a reliquary. From velvet he lifted out brushes with handles worn to his grip, a chalk stump, a roll of linen, a small vial of rabbit glue that had learned to smell like old prayer, and pigments corked and labeled, the ferocious cheer of chrome yellow, the faithful cowardice of lead white, and a little packet of green he did not name in front of ladies. "Emerald comes, dear," he said when asked, and smiled. He did not mention the arsenic. Men who mean to make lasting impressions never do. The master, Silas Colfax, appeared when summoned and nodded toward the painter and then toward the chair in a single motion that announced possession. He wore boredom like a fob. He had already measured the parlor wall where this likeness would prove his domestic economy to guests and creditors both. Behind his brow, an idea had crystallized. One gets a picture, so the girl behaves for posterity, if not for the season. Paper keeps wills. Canvas can remind a face it has obligations. The first sitting began with chalk, Favreau sketching the architecture of chin and brow, the line at the jaw that would have made a plainer girl merely handsome. Annabeth kept still, not out of vanity but fear of being called to too much attention by a man about to be her husband. He had been named already, not by her mouth. A minor planter with clean accounts and rough hands, Carlton Beale came for supper on Thursdays and did not notice when she disappeared from the conversation, the way a candle does not notice which wall it lights. In the pantry hall, a bolt faced in on a door that should have been allowed to breathe. The house had learned inward iron years before when it took custody of a woman's illness until the doctor could arrive, and then took custody more often because men love habits that flatter them as prudence. Rooms that keep you for your own good learn the taste of their owner's sleep. Someone had said that out back once, and the someone had not been welcome to the front gallery since. Yet the sentence stayed, finding a home in wood. The painter laid in the underdrawing until the shy miracle occurred, paper then linen offering back the subject's structure like it had been there all along, and he had only dusted. Eugenia Colfax pressed the bell, once, and tea arrived. Annabeth swallowed and blinked, the only motions permitted. Her throat found the choker's ribbon. If you sit quiet long enough, fabric grows a mind and begins to instruct the skin. In the second sitting, Favreau placed tone. He dug a dab of earth pigment with a knife and smoothed it to a temperament that would complement heat. The green, he promised Silas, would whisper hush money, not speak it. He worked the sleeves in their froth without drowning the arms. He turned to the face and set the undercolor thin, like a ghost consulted for permission. Annabeth's eyes did their useful trick, appearing to look at a person and a point behind them both, perfect for a parlor where men like meeting visions more than women. From the linen chest upstairs, Eugenia brought something that wasn't linen at all. 2 cuttings from a comb, hair coiled and wrapped in tissue that made moths respectful. She had tied the papers with ribbon torn from an old bonnet, memory disguised as thrift. She did not ask permission. She asked tradition to lean. "For fidelity," she said to Favreau when the men had drifted. He raised an eyebrow in a city way trained to admire sentiment so long as it can be varnished. He knew the practice, hairwork in brooches and rings and in the glue sizing itself. A Victorian appetite imported early into heat. He broke the seal of the papers and let the strands, Annabeth's, and a second smaller coil of a girl who had not lived long enough for portraits, fall into his hand with the gravity of something worshipped and misunderstood. He added the hair to the rabbit glue when no one was looking. The sizing took on an odor that even he recognized as an intimacy art should not know. He brushed it thin on the linen where ground met face and waited for tack, whispering the words men whisper when they mean to bind beauty to wall. Stay, behave, belong to us. Annabeth's throat tightened. The room remained cool enough to claim innocence. She pressed her tongue to the roof of her mouth to turn panic into mathematics. She counted the time between brush taps and the painter's breaths and the small bell on the side table, where Eugenia left it after ringing the tea. 3 different measures, none of them admitting the one she wanted. The windows. Out in the yard, Charity, Eugenia's maid since girlhood and her friend before that name had been taken from them by proximity to a house like this, hung out towels and kept her weather eye. She had been to a woman on Bay Lane who knew how to talk to bones at midnight. The woman had said a picture can be an engine if a man primes it with enough prayer and a little theft. Charity had brought a sprig of something to lay behind the frame later, something that grew bitter and ate lies with appetite. She didn't tell Eugenia she had it, not because Eugenia would disapprove, because the woman on Bay Lane had said a charm left unspoken might have time to become a choice. In the 3rd sitting, a letter arrived from Carlton Beale, half polite, full of ownership. He would like to see the artist's work to judge whether the likeness did a duty. He wrote in a hand that had taught numbers to fear him and words to do chores. Silas smiled. "Of course," Muddy said, and sent a boy. The painter adjusted the sketch to favor compliance, chin not quite so defiant in light, mouth a degree more patient, shoulders made into a domestic promise rather than a brace against weather. He did it with the speed of a man who has learned to survive on the admiration of men who do not know how art turns spines into sermons. That evening, Eugenia and Charity stood over the canvas after it had been set away. The sizing gleamed thin with a truth women know because their hands have been made to learn it. What men call order is often just their appetite hung straight. Eugenia set 2 fingers to the linen and withdrew them quick when she felt the tack like flesh. Charity said nothing. She set the sprig down on the table near the frame where it could go missing without being lost. The next morning, Annabeth was pale enough to make men feel useful. Eugenia sent her to the porch with lemonade and brought her back in time for a sitting. Favreau ignored the faintness. Faintness in a subject flatters a man's idea of gentility. He worked the eyes now, dark azurite under lead-white highlights, then a glaze of that green he had promised the men would be a whisper. Arsenic makes colors look like afternoon forever. He did not say the word to himself. He had learned not to name poisons in rooms where women keep the air. When he packed for the day, he dropped one of his cloths. Charity took it to the yard and sniffed it like a mother does a child's shirt to discover whether a day has behaved. It smelled of oil, glue, and a sweetness that does not belong to paint. She took the sprig and pressed it between frame and linen where thumbtacks would go. She spoke under breath, not to bind, to remind. Rooms will do you a mercy if you give them a job no one else will. At the 4th sitting, the bell rang twice without hands. A draft in the chimney made metal complain at itself. Eugenia made a face. Favreau smiled. He liked a room that pretended he had acquired metaphysics along with technique. He set the ribbon at the throat too tight by mistake or design. Men are careless that way when training a line to behave. Annabeth swallowed it down, a little womanly trick that takes a troublesome breath and rests it in the belly where men won't see. Carlton Beale came in and put his boot heel down on the parlor rug with enough authority to make Fiber consider despairing. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his vest and practiced admiration like a farmer at auction. He loved the picture instantly. Men recognize their reflections fastest when arranged by other men's hands. "She looks," he said, and did not find a word that would serve in company. "Good," he settled on. Eugenia smiled into the air and Charity turned away under the excuse of mending a tassel. After that, Carlton insisted on a sitting where he stood behind the painter, breathing approval. Favreau bore it, adding a ring at the finger and a slight softening to the mouth that told itself to please. He increased the green. He whispered again while he varnished. Varnish turns breath into something permanent if you time it with summer. He warmed it, dripped it, brushed it thin. The gloss sat on the face like a thought that appreciated the way men had arranged it. The night the varnish set, the house did not sleep right. The bell rang once in the parlor because metal has opinions. In the pantry, the inward-facing bolt found its seat with a satisfaction that announced a policy had been written and adopted without reading. In Annabeth's room, the mirror, inherited from a grandmother who had never learned to forgive men for dying at the wrong timetable, made the candle look like three flames trying to remember they once belonged to the same wick. Annabeth went to her window and lifted the sash and set her head out into heat. The moss on the oaks hung like unspoken kindnesses, fibrous and patient. Somewhere a night insect sang a long note that asked a question and did not expect answer. She set her fingers in the ribbon at her throat and untied. Skin should not have to ask permission of cloth. She set the ribbon on the sill and watched air run its fingers through it. The ribbon moved as if it preferred the edge. In the morning, Eugenia rose to find a hairpin where it should not be, under the parlor chair where Favreau had rested a brush. She picked it up and felt something like a bite. She told herself she had imagined it. She set the pin in a dish. Charity came behind and took it and put it in her apron because certain small iron wishes do not belong on tables men sit at. Favreau came to sign. He did it neatly in a corner where the eye would find it later and imagine itself brave for thinking the name mattered. He took his money without checking the count because Silas paid like a man who never apologizes, even when he has done exactly what apologies were invented for. The painter left with velvet empty and his hand smelling of rabbit glue and a woman's hair and that gentle poison in the green. He boarded a coach for Augusta with the idea that he had done a good thing for a family. He had taken a moment and designed it to last. The first harm was small enough for gentlemen. Carlton lifted the picture with the help of two men and set it above the parlor fireplace. A position vanity instructs men to choose, and physics insists on regretting. The room changed shape when the frame took the nail. Eugenia felt it in her wrists. Charity felt it in her teeth. The varnish caught light and taught it to stare properly. The fire below made breath thin, and the green brightened with a coquettish malice that flattered visitors and warned others. Annabeth took sick the next day. Nothing showy. A fever that came shamefaced and admitted to tiredness. The physician recommended tonics and staying in cool rooms, and wrote a note to Silas that complimented the portrait with more enthusiasm than the girl. Carlton sent flowers and returned the next Thursday, pleased to see how the painting made a better hostess of the wall than a flesh-and-blood bride could manage when she needed to lie down. A week later, a pair of canaries in their cage, Eugenia's, died without fuss. The window had been open. Air should have saved them. But arsenic will make a house think loyalty is a perfume and perfume is a prayer. The bird's stillness taught Charity something she did not have words for. She opened the back door and let a draft line see itself from the parlor to the yard. She placed the sprig she had saved from the frame under the lowest board by the hearth and set her heel on it to make it remember what job it had applied for. Silas went to his desk and wrote 2 letters, one to Belle about a date that would please all parties for certain papers to be signed, the other to his factor about a debt that needed to be pressed in a neighboring county. He stacked them and set a paperweight on top. Green glass, expensive and dummy as a high-born idiot. He admired his parlor one more time and convinced himself the painting was a kind of moral instrument. Houses use that word when they mean the furniture has agreed to make hypocrisy look like stewardship. The second harm was harder to hide. Carlton Beale came in the afternoon with his mouth carrying the mood of a man who has decided to congratulate himself before the work is done. He stood under the painting and raised a hand to adjust the chain that held it. Just a hair, he said, to keep it level. The nail bit. The chain learned shame. And the frame rocked once, then fell into the room like a final answer. Carlton stepped aside with vanity's quickness. The corner caught him across the mouth with the smoothness of a command. Blood embarrassed the carpet. He laughed and said something about his clumsiness and received Eugenia's napkin, and then Charity's second, the one that actually stanches. He left early. In the hall, he pressed his fingers to the cut and tasted the first honest thing that had entered his mouth on the premises. The painting survived, the varnish making a little whine as it resettled on the second nail. If a person had gotten their ear close, you could have heard hair under glue move the way a creature does in sleep when it decides to wait to wake because it is not yet wanted. Annabeth stood in the parlor alone later and regarded the likeness that had been placed in front of her future like a sign painted for a road she did not want to take. The eyes looked back at her with a kindness immigrants practice, borrowed and good enough to pass as local. She lifted her hand and put her fingertips to her own throat, like a woman learning to say her name in a different language. The bell on the side table rang once of its own will. Eugenia came in over the sound and did not say she had heard it. She set her hand on her daughter's elbow and felt heat under skin. You are supposed to call Bloom to keep a house from meeting the truth too soon. We will position the curtains to keep the green from brightening, she said. A woman's way of choosing her fight when the war has already been lost. In the room at the back where Silas kept his accounts, the window stuck at 3 inches, summer's revenge on paint. He wrote engagement on a line in the family ledger and underlined it once. The ink refused to dry as quick as his habit. He fanned the page and did not think about the way paper will betray people if you teach it to think that loyalty and binding are the same thing. He heard the bell in the parlor like a compliment. He did not earn it. At night, the portrait gathered the way light had touched it all day and kept the best parts for itself. The house did not like it. Houses prefer their light to be verifiable. Rooms work hard for their flickers. A picture that insists on eating glow after hours is a lodger with manners too smooth to trust. Eugenia dreamed of a ribbon pulled taut beyond reason. Charity woke with the taste of green in her mouth and went to the kitchen to find water without remembering her feet. Silas slept like a man who approves of his own myths. The last sitting had been signed. There would be no more painter. A canvas doesn't need him once it has learned the room. It prefers the bell. It prefers the way men walk in and give it something without meaning to. It prefers the trick of green, bright at noon, deadly by supper, a new theory of elegance. What a picture binds isn't only hair, it is the order of ownership. Men's names beneath women's faces and law's language anchored in pigments that have their own appetites. When the frame came from the carvers, the nails had been driven with their heads proud enough to be admired. Silas had instructed inward nails instead, where the liner met the back. A man's idea of prudence. A carpenter's sin he can be paid to forget. Iron remembers. Direction matters. On Sunday, the preacher came and blessed the house in a manner that announced he had been invited to admire donations later. He admired the portrait to the point of folly. Grace, he said, and then corrected to likeness. He told Eugenia it would comfort her in old age. He told Annabeth it would humble her in youth. He told Silas it would outlast him. He told Charity nothing. He did not say her name. He rang the bell by way of thanking the house for not making him sweat. On Monday, the canaries had been replaced, because wealth believes death a solvable inconvenience. On Tuesday, the woman from Bay Lane came to the yard as a laundress, a respectable costume for knowledge. Charity met her by the line and told her what had been done: the hair, the green, the inward nails. The woman listened the way a person does when there is no novelty to the wickedness, just a new application. "Plants will take poison if you ask them right," she said. Not softly, not loud. She pressed a packet into Charity's palm. "Steep for breathing. Put what's left under hearthstone, left corner. Not to bind, to tell the old stones what job's next." On Wednesday, Carlton's mother came and set the approved date in Eugenia's hand with the finality of a paper slid over a counter. The parlor learned it. The picture enjoyed it. The bell congratulated everyone by ring once for a visitor, once for a telling, and a faint third that sounded like a mistake but was not. Eugenia went to the pantry and lay her head against the cool of a shelf and taught herself not to love her own daughter more than the system she had been raised to flatter. There are women who defy that training before supper and go hungry after. There are women who proceed with it and die quietly of certain long illnesses. She chose a third door. She went to the parlor when no one looked and put her fingers to the lower right corner of the frame where an inward nail had begun to rust and pulled. Rust resists the first woman hand and then confesses to the second. The nail came out with a sound a room should not make for iron. She put it in her pocket. She said nothing. She poured the steep the woman had given into Annabeth's cup at night. She asked the old stones to remember they were forest first. The portrait learned her. Pictures do not care for mothers who refuse to admire them on their own terms. It kept adjusting itself in the night. Minute angles, subtle shifts in how the green grinned, a crackle and varnish like a low conversation between chemicals and malice. The mirror across the parlor caught the face by accident and made it into 3, then 2, then something like regret. The bell rang once, then did not ring again because even instruments have to learn there are hours when the room prefers to keep its counsel. The morning the engagement was to be read in the paper failed. The printing press stuck on a line about barter in the docks. The boy from the press kept his wages and promised to bring a corrected sheet at dinner. Silas paced. Carlton came early. Eugenia wrapped her hand around the nail in her pocket until the rust printed on her palm, and then planted that palm on the jamb near the portrait as if blessing a child she had lied to for its own good, and intended to rescue anyway. Something in the house said enough the way a beam says it when a man has come upstairs with a crate too heavy to be called domestic. The bell rang once, true as lunch. The hearth spat green that reddened in a second and cooled without leaving ash. The left hearthstone lifted a hair's breadth and set itself down again as if adjusting to new employment. Carlton said something about humidity. Silas laughed and said something about superstitious Irishmen in the press room. The picture enjoyed. That night, a flare in Annabeth's breath climbed into her throat and would not be reasoned with. She could not swallow tea. She could not name the panic without paying for the speech. Eugenia sat and pressed her hand to the girl's breastbone and counted until the count obeyed. Charity brought a bowl into which she had steeped what the woman had said to steep and held it under the chin of someone she would have killed to protect. And the steam and the sweetness and the wickedness in the plant argued with what had been put into glue, and the breath relented. Annabeth slept. The portrait waited. Men who had congratulated themselves on running a good house slept like cats on chairs they thought were theirs. The following afternoon, the first cough started with the housekeeper's boy. He kept to the yard, but Eyre is social and learns men's habits. Within a week, a fever ran the place like a ledger. It picked staff first for practice, then took a number from Eugenia's chest and made her lie down flat to hear it. Silas blamed the river and the season and a ship from somewhere he had learned to call dirty each time he wanted to say cheap. Annabeth did not go down into it. The steepings and the charm and the one nail in a pocket made a small wall which breath could lean against. She went to the parlor and stood under the portrait. She looked at her own painted eyes and asked in her head, without hope, whether the woman on the wall could be taught to favor the woman in the house over the man in the ledger. The painted mouth seemed to think about answering. The bell said no, once. When the fever left in August, it took 3 names: the boy in the yard, a woman who had dusted the planter's library for 20 years, and one of the undercooks who had sung so softly you never could be sure whether your ear had been to blame for not catching verse or humming. Eugenia got up and stood at the head of the stairs and went back to bed without drama. Silas poured a drink at noon and killed a letter. Carlton delayed the date by 2 weeks out of decency, and then promised a new day with the ease of men who have never been taught to pay interest on other people's breath. Annabeth went to the pantry. She took the nail from her mother's pocket, where it had been put for safekeeping, and pressed it into the wood of the shelf as if asking it to learn what trees were for. She took the second inward nail herself from the frame. Iron recognizes a project when it has met it enough times. It yielded to her with less complaint than before. She set the nail with the first and pressed again until her palms learned rust as a kind of education. Favreau had gone on. The Colfax's story did not trouble his travel. He painted a doctor's wife in Augusta with a baby on her lap that would die before frost. He put hair in the glue again because men like stories that make their hands feel like priests. He sent a letter to the Colfaxes, asking if their picture kept its honor near heat. Silas did not answer because he had discovered that paper is a tool he used and that this time he required silence to make it lie correctly. The portrait stayed. The green learned the hour when best to show itself and chose it, making noon a kind of theater and evening a space of small private crimes. The varnish kept dust and also detained mercy. The painted eyes pretended to regard a point beyond men. Women who had sat under it and survived chose to look elsewhere. The Belle learned to tell the truth only by accident. Then the small ruin arrived that changes an object into a legend. Carlton, impatient with air and with women's lungs and with a calendar that had offended him by not prostrating often enough, took Annabeth's hand in the parlor and suggested a promenade across the square. Eugenia smiled into a corner, because habits. Charity stood to the side with a hand inside her apron, holding an iron wish. Silas kept to the rear with a packet that needed to be seen by other men as a document that bound breath. They stepped into heat. On the wall above a fireplace that had been made to apologize for an August, in a city that does not accept apologies from non-sentient things, the portrait let loose a sound you only hear when glue changes its mind. Tiny and absolute, a crackle like frost in a letter dipped in fire. The bell rang once in warning, then twice as if honoring a wedding promised. Outside in the bright, a horse up the street shied at nothing. Carlton fumbled the hat and swore. Annabeth's breath stepped wrong and fell. She stooped to retrieve the ribbon she had dropped and met the ground with the clean economy of a woman who has chosen to faint. The dust clouded her throat. The ribbon, traitor to cloth, blew toward a drain. Carlton reached. For the hat, not the girl. Silas reached. For the paper. Eugenia reached and caught the girl's head before it met stone with the sort of competence old women in good houses are never paid for. Charity reached with both hands and took what the house offered her, in this case a choice. She put her foot on the ribbon and did not let it go. When she lifted it, she made a decision that would get into the glue of a picture and trouble the room every time a bell had the nerve to speak without being spoken to. She tied the ribbon around the nail in her pocket and set a knot that would not celebrate. When they carried Annabeth back into the parlor, the portrait had a new line in it, so small no gentleman would see. It ran from the corner of the mouth to the point where a shadow had been asked to lie about the chin. The room noticed. The mirror bowed to it. The bell behaved. They put Annabeth on the chaise and fanned and steeped and counted. She breathed. She looked at the picture and did not forgive it for having been made. Night fell, and the house rearranged itself for the unpleasantness it had expected, but felt it had been too solid to admit, an old curse disguised as a new fashion. The portrait shone. Men admired. Women began to teach themselves a toolkit that would end, years from now, with someone clever enough to remove the frame and tell the nails to face the correct direction. For the moment the paint held. The glue held. The green did what it always does when asked to live in wealthy rooms. It kept the color of sickness beautiful. The bell rang once of its own ambition. Eugenia listened. Charity did not. In the pantry, rust taught wood a language it had been waiting to learn. In the ledger, ink is still wet where it ought to be dry. In the girl, breath counted itself without being persuaded by noon. And on that wall a face learned how to swallow sound. Pictures admire themselves for that trick. Houses hate them for it. The portrait behaved like a well-kept weapon, quiet in company, whispering only to those it could own. By September the house had learned its manners around it, the way a river town learns when to hold its breath for a steamboat's wake. Eugenia shifted the curtains at noon to starve the green, but light is clever and pockets itself in guilt the way lies do when fed. Charity kept the left hearthstone listening, leaf-steeped air moving through rooms as if breath were a job someone had to keep on shift. Silas wrote to the editor. The editor obliged with a paragraph that called the likeness serene, and the bride-to-be a study in constancy, which is what men in heat call a girl who has decided to survive for now. Carlton cut that clipping neat as a script and kept it in his coat's inside pocket and felt for it sometimes with 2 fingers in public, the way a man confirms a bribe stays bought. Annabeth stopped looking at people's mouths when they spoke. She looked instead at the thin space between lip and sentence where the bell in that parlor had taught words to wait for permission. Women learn this geometry early when paintings are present. The doctor came with his bag, breathed in a patient's face like a man receiving a service, and suggested quiet, air, and a bitter cordial. He admired the picture with expertise and left a bill that would be settled by compassion in Eugenia's hand and law in Silas's. "It will keep her," he said to the frame, as if a gilded rectangle might lay a girl down more gently than a body could. He meant it kindly. That is the meanest kind. In late October, the lady next door, Mrs. Wheatley, who wore pearls when it rained because pearls look truer in weather, came to sit on the settee and be seen admiring a thing the town had decided meant quality. She grew breathless near the fire, smiled her apology toward the portrait, and patted her bosom the way Savannah women have always coaxed breath. On her way out, she put her hand to the door and said, "One forgets how the green can lean," which made the room admit a fact it had been instructed to call taste. A day later, a kitchen girl coughed until her ribs complained of their profession and then stopped. The parlor stayed cool that afternoon without anyone moving the curtains. The bell rang once, then stayed still, then rang again very softly, which is worse. The house is not a jury. It is a stage. Somebody had posted too many lines. Silas's ledger learned a new column that fall. Unexpected expenses, a phrase that means the truth is not welcome on paper. First a bill at the apothecary, then another at the undertaker. The yard boy's small coffin charged with a neat hand as if neatness made price palatable. Then a loan extended to a man upriver who would pay it back when yellow fever stopped rearranging the social register on Hutchinson Island. Silas kept the figures aligned and found consolation in the way numbers behave when you press them. He missed the way living things have opinions. He pressed harder. He moved money into rooms where men shake hands and feel saved. He moved dates on contracts the way a man moves chairs to hide scuffs. He explored selling a parcel that had been his wife's dowry, and Eugenia learned that her father had loved his cards more than his daughter's security. He told her as if he were telling a story that did not require sympathy. The portrait liked it. Paintings adore men who make rooms into ledgers. They keep. When people came on Thursdays, the eyes in the frame did their trick with light, and the green promised husbands that the house would keep wives like flowers pressed between pages. Men believed. They always do when a color tells them it will do their hardest business in the prettiest voice. But green carries a ledger of its own, a bookkeeping of breath and nerve and small birds. Add hair to glue, and you teach the binder to count differently. "You should promise a date to the paper," Carlton said again at supper, cutting meat like the animal owed him cleanness. "There is a virtue to print." He meant he had tired of rumor and preferred the kind of announcement that makes girls behave. After New Year, Eugenia said, because women learned in rooms like this to keep calendars as weapons and salves both. Let the fever quit its opinion of the city. We will not ask people to come gather breath in a house we have not yet persuaded to be kind. Silas looked at the portrait as if it were his partner in prudence. The house is safe, he said, which is something men like to put on a day and walk under. He was not lying. He was ignorant. That is the other sin paintings evangelize when the varnish has been asked to perform law. When the first frost hit, mean and felt like forgiveness, Carlton pressed for contracts. God has taken his. We must make our own entries, he said, in a tone borrowed from men who keep ledgers with ships on them. He brought a lawyer. The lawyer admired the frame and set a quill to paper and cleared his throat after each sentence, because habit believes in its own music. Eugenia held her hands in her lap and made one finger press the nail mark she had worn there into a rosary. Annabeth signed with a hand that belonged to evenings in front of a window with a book on its spine and a lamp set low, not to this public habit that made breath small, but she signed because breath is the currency until a room can be persuaded to accept another. 2 days later, the portrait shifted in its chain again. No fall this time, a tilt. Carlton walked up to it with a smile that asked for applause and set it straight. See? He said to the room. Some things require only a hand. Charity looked at his hand like she might look at a hinge that had betrayed one too many doors. She went to the hearth, lifted the left stone with her palm like a woman's muscle is a type of book men do not read, and set under it the last of the rough leaf from a sack the Bay Lane woman had given. To remind, she said to the stone. The house sneezed. A board in the back hall. A pinched complaint from a shutter. Mercy, Eugenia said, to nobody. The bell answered once. Worse things began, but gently, because cruelty prefers a ramp it can be admired on. The canaries died again. A seam split in a sleeve of a dress no hand had handled roughly. A cousin off for the weekend fell off a horse and broke a collarbone in exactly the slope the painter had suggested for Annabeth's shoulder to please male taste. In town, a boy on Bull Street, otherwise healthy, took a fit near a shop window where a chromolithograph had been set with a hateful green to sell soap. The doctor called it a coincidence in the way men call architecture accidental when a ceiling falls on a sentence they were about to enjoy. Christmas came decent in weather and indecent in luck. The household kneaded gratitude into breads and laid the good knives in a line like swords offered for truce. The preacher came with an appetite and left his hat with his dignity. He blessed the portrait again because men believe prayer can be sprayed like vinegar on stain. He told a story about kings that made the girl under the frame look over the blessed man's head at air. That night, the ribbon around the nail in Eugenia's pocket burned her through cloth. She woke, sat at the edge of the bed, and let her feet remember they had been their own once. She went to the parlor with Charity behind, no lamp because women can walk in the dark in houses that hate them and not stumble. She set her hand to the lower right corner of the frame and felt the inward-facing nails like rude breath on skin. She pulled the second. It came out with a cough and a little varnish. She put the nail on her tongue to keep from saying a word that would get back to angels and make them quit this address. Not tonight, Charity whispered. There are nights when iron wants to move and nights when iron will remember what it has pledged itself to and file for divorce noisily. Pick wrong and a house breaks open in a graceless way. Eugenia nodded. She put the nail back in her pocket with the ribbon and lay down on the parlor rug under the picture, because a woman who has learned that objects can be engines may choose sometimes to sleep under the axle and accept no promise from the driver. At dawn, a mule's bell in the lane woke them where people live, not where paintings perform. The parlor bell rang too, politely. Then it waited. The portrait's green had gone gray in the early hour, the arsenic feeling watchful rather than in love. The varnish held a scratch across the throat, a hairline, nothing a man would bother to remark unless vanity offered it an audience. Charity put her thumb on the scratch, an indecency in any other room, and whispered, "Let her go." The scratch looked bigger to the two women after that, and smaller to everyone else, which is how prayer works in houses that prefer accuracy to applause. January brought good weather for funerals and bad for shipping. Silas wrote down a loss and wrote down a win and convinced himself arithmetic proved providence. He took a loan disguised as generosity from a man at the bank who complimented the portrait and said his own wife could use the discipline of a likeness. He sent a wire to Augusta. He did not speak of the small rash around his cuff that itch taught him to keep from being seen. He had always considered his body a minor servant who sometimes faltered. It irritated him to feel mortal where a sleeve meets a wrist. Carlton pressed for May. The paper obliged. People congratulated one another for knowing in advance. A local sport. The portrait gleamed. The bell rang for visitors. The household made lists that read like spells. Sugar, rice, bows, patience. The auctioneer gave his throat its warm-up sermon and rang the bell. The room arranged its appetites. Lots went in order: silver, sugar tongs, a tea caddy with a key no one had, a pair of French chairs that made a certain kind of man sit up straighter for no reason, an engraving of Rome that had never seen Italy. Prices rose like bread behaving under a patient hand. The bell blessed each sin. No one felt accused. When the portrait stood on the easel and turned the room into a smaller church, the auctioneer dropped his voice and the room lifted its chin. "A likeness by Favreau," he said, "because names keep prices honest and lies easy. A Savannah face people will be honored to live with." He meant a woman's survival would fetch a decent sum for a man. He smiled the smile men learn when they can sell mysteries without understanding them. Bids came quick, then slow, the way people empty their pockets with grace first and arithmetic after. A planter from Glynn called out a number that sounded as if his wife had chosen it. A lawyer half offered because the banker had not yet had the courage to stop admiring his own voice. Dorothea bid high once to flatter the Colfaxes and stepped back because she had already satisfied her appetite for borrowing curses. The banker lifted 2 fingers. The auctioneer lifted his chin as if the room had read a verse and praised it. "Sir," the auctioneer said, and the banker nodded as if a picture belongs in a house only when a man who lends other men money has blessed it. Carlton raised a number that suggested chivalry and concealed a need to be the kind of man a town likes to recognize. Silas made his face polite, the way men do when they need all of their enemies to win and fail on the same day. From the side hall, Annabeth heard a sound that had nothing to do with bids. A bell outside on the river answered the indoor bell by accident or by promise, the kind of maritime note that says a tide has decided something, and men will have to walk quickly to pretend they agreed. She moved a little nearer to the door and felt air come in, not from the square, but from the lane that leads to water. She smiled without amusement. She put her hand on the jamb and found rust there, though how rust found an auction room door is a matter for sermons and fiction, and both have better things to do today. The bidding settled into a duel no one would call a duel, so a ceremony would not be required. The banker arranged his mouth around numbers. Carlton arranged his jaw around pride. The portrait pretended to look at the opposite wall where a painting of a ship made waves out of varnished lies. The room pretended to prefer men who could pronounce 600 without making 6 sound like sex and 100 like hunger. When the number reached a place where air gets thin, Charity shifted her weight. The rope on the dray sighed the way rope does when it has been taught 2 tasks and has decided to like the second. Eugenia found the knot with her eye the way a woman finds drops of blood nobody else will acknowledge, and her breathing resolved into a number of its own, 4, 3, 2, like someone fashioning a bell out of lungs. "Sold," the auctioneer said, and the bell struck, and the banker smiled at the room to help it practice admiring him for this, and not the other thing it has been forced to practice admiring him for. "Consigned to shipping," the banker's clerk said to the drayman, not understanding that he had just invited a soul into a river with the courtesy men reserve for furniture. "New Orleans steamer, first light." People clapped, because men clap when evil enters the next chapter wearing a bow. The portrait took the bell's pretty approval like air and held it. It did not know the difference between a wall that plans to keep it and a pier that plans to drown it. Pictures do not do tide tables. They do pride. In the back lane, the crate went on the dray with a noise that would have gotten a boy whipped if he'd dropped a pail like that. Charity touched the rope once, as if reminding it that honest knots can be taught decency when asked by the right fingers. She did not untie anything. She set the short in, gentle, a weakness on purpose in one place, a better knot in another, a shade of slack a river would recognize as invitation and a clerk would mistake for good work. "Stay the night," the clerk told the drayman. "Ship at dawn." He folded the consignment paper and slipped it into his breast with the sort of care men give a letter from a girl who shouldn't have written. Eugenia walked behind, not to encourage herself. Some women do not require cheerleading to perform necessary treasons, but to be present at the moment where a wrong is made into an accident you can live with. She had tied a ribbon to a nail. She would now give rope to water. She would not pray out loud. She would carry the sin herself because women in houses like these eat more curses than men's stories can account for. At the river, the wharf bell sounded, not announcement, habit. The tide leaned. Ships sulked and sung. Men who worked for wages and for lungs cursed and laughed and tossed lines the way boys throw selves and hope someone will forgive them later. The dray rolled onto planks where a slip would invite a city to look this way with relish. Air smelled like rope remembers. Tar, salt, old ships, newer lies. "Here," the clerk said, signaling a berth at the end where a two-tier steamer, with a face like a smug judge, took cargo as if generosity had been written into its timbers. He signed. He handed a coin. He turned. He became a man with somewhere else to be at last light. The drayman went on with the habit that keeps men alive. "Check this. Tighten that. Speak to your animal by name so it will remember yours." He did not see the small, short Charity had taught the rope to love. He did not need to. He had done his part in a world where hands make more sense than pens. A gust came up the water that tasted like the Bay Lane woman's packet, bitter, useful, paying attention. The crate leaned a degree nobody owns. The rope took the weight into its lie and then, as invited, gave. The portrait went from wharf to air the way a note does when you slap it out of a bell. Then from air to water, the way debts go to ground when a house has decided it wants to live. There was a splash not large enough to be disgraceful, but not small enough to be mistaken for a box of books falling off a preacher's cart. Two men cursed with the particular abandon of bodies that enjoy having been given a useful mistake to announce. "Hold!" one yelled, as if holding water were a skill men have. "Hook!" cried another, reaching for a gaff a boy had set too far down the pier. The gaff came late. The crate turned like a person in a fever finding the cool part of the pillow. Then it settled. The river closed its mouth as if good manners required that when one hosts a guest rumored to control breath, one should not gossip at volume. The steamer captain walked to the gang and looked down with a face that says insurance has opinions. "What was that?" he asked the clerk in a voice men use when they will later say regrettable to wives and personal Jesuses. "A picture," the clerk said, honesty having found him at last from behind the ribs. "Sir's property." He said the banker's name and watched the captain's frown obey. Men's faces know a ledger, even when it breathes. "We'll fish it?" the drayman offered, with the innocence of someone not paid to calculate the weight of sin in water. "Dredge catches enough," the captain said without pity or pride. He looked at the sky to pretend he had talked to God about this. He had not. The river and Charity and Eugenia had already concluded the prayer. Too deep now. The wharf bell rang twice, which means something in some towns and nothing in this one, but the sound felt like the Colfax parlor bell choosing to be human for a minute. Charity's throat loosened. She had not realized it had been clenched since May. Eugenia put her hand on the pier post as if to bless a tree that had chosen boats over sparrows. "Unfortunate," said a voice beginning to fret at its own proximity to gossip. It was Dorothea, of course. She had followed at a distance like a woman visiting a lover's grave she is not permitted to mention. "Perhaps it will wash ashore at some less practical bend," she offered, because Savannah cannot help choosing irony in place of lament. Carlton, late because pride arrived when others had finished work, reached the pier and looked at the water as if a man can ask it to reconsider. He made a shape of his mouth that suggested heroism, and then did not jump. "I would have bought it," he said to silence, as if that would have taught glue to swim. He had to say something. Men like him keep a small archive of words for when rooms go wrong and none fit. Silas came last, because numbers had detained him and then refused to comfort him. He stood between the captain and the clerk and chose to be angry with the wrong instrument. "You're not," he said to the drayman, because men punch down even when water has just done the moral heavy lifting on their behalf. The drayman looked at his rope with affection and confusion. Charity looked at Silas with the sorrow a person feels watching a tool that will not learn. The banker appeared, breathless with indignation and calculation both. "You will answer," he said to no one, which is how men first speak to the fates when fates have ruined their afternoon on the way to improving their souls. He glared at water. Water keeps books and accepts glares like tips and splits them to the penny with wind. "Insurance," the captain said. The banker calmed. "Men will forgive many crimes if a column exists where someone else can write their names in comfort." The crate did not bob. It sank with the confidence of a decision too long deferred. Down there it unstapled slowly. Glue forgot art and remembered bones, hair unbraided. Green wandered into shadow where it did less harm, because even poison grows tired in silt. Iron turned honest the way nails do when asked by a well to tell the truth. There were eels. They are impartial. They swam by. The story started walking immediately, because Savannah hates to let grief cool before putting a ribbon on it. "Fell at the wharf," a boy told a grocer's wife. "Pulled itself down," she improved. "The river wanted it," said a parlor that had not been invited, and would have pretended to be offended if it had. The banker bought salt. Someone gossiped obscenely in a way that explained the world to itself for 15 minutes. "A judgment," murmured a woman with a ribbon beside a nail in her pocket. Annabeth exhaled that evening like a woman who has been told she will live with a scar and finds the gift indecent and necessary. The house let the parlor bell do a new job, call people to stew, and not to the ordering of souls. The left hearthstone took heat and let it go the way trained rooms do when you hire them for honest work. The mirror caught faces and did not multiply them. The portrait's place on the wall looked like a window had been promised, and a wall had kept its deal with the roof instead. The banker sent a man to drag the river for 3 days, because money likes exhibits. Men fished up a chair leg, a crate of oranges that had learned how to be soup, and a small box of cutlery that had belonged to someone who had believed men would return stolen things if monogrammed. They did not find a frame. They did not find a face. They found a ribbon, indescribable by any clerk without a woman present, to make the sentence honest. Carlton broke the engagement by letter in a hand that practiced sorrow and achieved relief. He made it a favor. He said her constitution was poorly suited to heat, as if a heart comes with a map and a preference for latitudes. He kept the clipping in his coat for a time and then lost it under someone else's chair. He married 2 years later a woman whose portrait never hung over a fire. He developed a small cough of no moral interest to anyone after 40. Silas took the banker's forgiveness as if he had earned it. He did not sell the dowry parcel. He learned, dimly, that rooms cost more when you ask them to do law. He lost a case over a note in August, won one in December, and never again used the parlor as proof. He died 20 years on with his hand on a bell rope in a different house, and no one mentioned art at his funeral, because art had improved the town by removing itself. Dorothea threw one party less per season than previously and learned, grudging, to admire weddings where no pictures had been asked to bless. She told the story for years in the way bored women make themselves important. She never once mentioned Charity's hands. Eugenia kept the nail and the ribbon in a small tin next to pins and apologies. Some nights she pressed the tin to her breastbone like a woman holding the ghost of a weight she has decided not to pass along to children. She stopped admiring men who admire pictures. She learned to put her hand on the door jamb when she meant something that needed to be said without a witness. Charity carried the left hearthstone with her when she left that house for another, on purpose. One evening, when a door's latch had been turned outward so often it forgot how to lie, she set the stone in a yard near an herb patch and taught a new kitchen the job. She kept a packet empty, as a warning and a promise, and a space for air. And down in the river the portrait unmade itself into the things that had made it: glue, hair, pigment, pride. The green wandered into mud the way money does when it remembers it came from the earth. The hair loosened and turned into a line an eel touched and did not ask who of. The varnish forgot it had ever been used for permanence and made itself into something trees might not mind breathing if they didn't have to. The frame found a snag and stayed until rot taught it to move unimportant. The curse did not end. Curses do not end. They change addresses and adjectives. But this one, in this house, had been evicted. The bell rang for supper. The door learned the trick it should have known. The portrait stopped swallowing sound and the room got to hear its own children. By spring, people did not remember the face when they spoke of the Colfax parlor. They remembered the absence, which is the kind of memory a house prefers when asked to carry what the living cannot. The mirror, freed of the habit of multiplying harm, reflected girls who had their own faces. Mothers stopped pressing their tongues to the roofs of their mouths to trick panic. They taught their children to drink slower. The parlor found its ordinary light. It is a decent destiny for a room in a city that believes gravity is a gentleman and water an employee. The river bell rang one evening as if in answer to its cousin inland, and no one felt accused. The steamer slid by with men making jokes they would be sorry for, but not very. The wharf kept its grooves. The water kept its books. The house, which had once worshipped a frame, returned to keeping women alive, which is harder work and more honest. Spring came without apology, which is its way in a city that buries more than it admits. The Colfax parlor found its honest work, holding people, not stories about people. Light behaved on the wall where a frame had once taught it manners. It fell and left with the courtesy of weather. The bell returned to tasks that make a house decent: calling stew, calling neighbors, calling a child back from the step before the street embarrassed her mother. It rang once at noon and said nothing theological. Eugenia lived a long time under the absence. That is the quiet cost. No grande finale. Only years that do not require pretending the room is holy now that the idol is gone. She kept the tin in the drawer with pins, the nail nested with the ribbon like a truth she meant to remain available for anyone with the right grief. Sometimes she put it under her palm at night, to settle breath that had learned bad habits near green. She never told a priest. She did not need words that force women's work into men's categories. When she died, in a bed the house forgave, not the parlor, which had done too much. Charity placed the tin in the coffin because some objects shouldn't be left without employment, even underground. The preacher said a verse about treasures and hearts and did not know he had told the truth in accident. Silas survived himself in the way men do when a house evicts their favorite myth. He put more ink in ledgers and grew thinner under it. He stopped using walls as proof. He sat with visitors facing the open door rather than the absence on the plaster, as if he had learned that thresholds matter more than arrangements. He died in a different house with his hand on a rope he believed kept him in charge of something. The rope belonged to a bell that had spent its life learning not to obey. At his funeral, nobody praised good taste. Someone said steadfast, which is the kind of kindness men hope for when rooms give up on them. Carlton Beale's letter dissolved in a drawer, and then in memory. The scar at his mouth faded to a story he only told when he wanted to describe foolishness, without admitting he'd been its instrument. He married elsewhere and hung a small mirror over a mantel that reflected nothing except whoever had earned the room that evening. In his 40s, a cough came and stayed the way old accounts do when a man is tired. He did not die of it. He died of ordinary tiredness, which is not a judgment so much as a conclusion. Dorothea Beale hosted fewer cabinets of curiosity and more dinners where nothing pretended to outsmart breath. She told the river story with a flattering grammar when company required. She left out charity and the knot and the wind. It is not malice that removes certain hands. It is tradition, which is worse because it can be admired by committees. Favreau aged like a man whose name stays under varnish while his body stops enjoying stares. He painted 5 more wives, 2 children, a judge, and a dog, which turned out better than the judge. In an autumn when stomachs and fortunes both misbehaved, he walked through a lending library in Charleston and saw in a book of engravings a French essay about pictures that trapped their sitters. He laughed too loud and felt ashamed for enjoying superstition. A winter later he read in a clipped Savannah paper a story about an auction mishap at the river. He put the paper away and touched the part of his hand that had once smelled of glue and hair and poison and tried not to think in absolutes. He failed. The failure improved him more than his art had. The banker filed his loss and found a clause. Men like him have that trick where a misfortune eats a neighbor. A year later his house's roof leaked near a framed print of a Roman ruin. Men blamed the workmen and excused the irony. His daughter eloped with a violinist and did not send a good address. He kept a new bell by his door for clerks and applied dignity to it with rigor. It rang, and the sound respected no column. The wharf kept a memory grudgingly. Men found a strip of gilt nailed to a snag when the tide went mean in a January, and thought of selling it to a man in a shop who sold wedding rings to people who liked second chances. He bought it and made, without sentiment, a little frame for a daguerreotype of his dead mother. The photo looked severe within the gold. He set it on a counter and taught a bell to ring once when women came in with small paper purses. The bell learned modesty. The frame learned usefulness. Such are the ways curses are put back to work without dramatics. Charity moved houses and kept the habit of teaching doors which way they owe themselves. She took the left hearthstone with her once, wrapped in a shawl like a child, and set it near a stove that had not yet learned it could be gentle. She held her handovers at dusk, taught 2 girls to steep what needed steeping and to throw the rest where earth knows what it is, and said a sentence often, not to frighten them, to keep them sober. Note who benefits when a room falls quiet at the wrong hour. She made it a prayer. She made it a plan. When people later said, in good faith or bad, that a haunted picture had troubled Savannah, she answered, "Law and heat and men's appetite for obedience. The picture only liked applause." She spoke without malice. She stayed. Annabeth did not become a legend. She breathed. That's the honest end of most stories that newspapers hope will name a street. She did not marry Carlton. She married no one for a long time, and found that certain afternoons are less dangerous when nobody eats any of your hours just because law enjoys it. She read on the gallery and then, when the house announced itself ready, married a clerk with a slow temper and a good hand with numbers who liked the way light threw itself on her jaw. They hung a small daguerreotype in the parlor of a mother who would not carry her own likeness. They kept it away from heat and fashionable opinions. She pressed her thumb to the jamb when breath hedged. The wood remembered. She raised 2 daughters who learned to locate the seam in a plan and choose when to pull. When the girls asked for the story of the lost portrait, she told it without the curse part first. Then she added that men like to misname engines so the town will blame art when law has become insolent. The house that had once worshipped a face did better work after. It let people fail and be forgiven without a frame watching. It acquired chips in the banister where children confess their heights with knives when parents aren't looking. It creaked in the kind places, stairs on late nights when someone good came home, door frames in the afternoons when humidity makes everybody generous. Sometimes a visitor would glance at the wall over the mantel and say, "Was there a picture?" And the room would decline to recall. A room that has decided to be a house will refuse to teach outsiders its hardest truths. It saves them for women in the kitchen. The river kept the portrait the way a book keeps a sentence about to matter to the wrong person. It broke it to the syllables that built it. Pigment back to mud, hair to a line eels desired for a minute and then forgot. Glue to the kind of jelly loblolly pines understand. On certain dusks, people said, you could see green on the water that looked like law deciding to smile. On others, no color at all. Brown, honest breathing. A boy with a glove cut his foot on a plank of gild once, and his mother swore and spat, and wrapped the wound, and kept the gold for her sewing box, where it learned a good trade making hems behave. That is the right fate for arrogance, small duty performed under a woman's hand. The story, of course, learned to walk on its own. Decades on, a gentleman from Charleston told a guest cruelly that Savannah had no taste, having drowned a beauty. A lady from New Orleans corrected him kindly that Savannah had made an exchange, one room's air for one river's appetite. An economy she understood. A dealer in Boston placed a Favreau in a window and sold it to a man who admired his wife more after seeing it on the wall. Someone in Augusta whispered that hair and glue is a sin, and someone else said it is tender. Both insisted they were right. They both reached for their mallets at noon, just in case. Years unrolled their quiet greed. A war came and explained itself loudly. Bells learned duties they did not enjoy. Women taught doors to face out fast. Men carried portraits into wagons because they believed oil could bless a cause more than breath could. The river took more things because fire makes people sudden. The parlor survived because nothing in it wanted to impress the century. After, people came back and tried to be normal within walls that remembered what had been asked of them. The Colfax house made soup properly. It did not permit law to enter through frames anymore. It kept women warm. That was its contribution. Late in a century that did not love itself enough to speak plain, a man with spectacles and an ambition to catalog everything in a region that had refused to be cataloged came to Savannah and asked about the cursed portrait. He found in a back room of a museum a chipped gilt scrap and a card in a hand that lied prettily. From the Colfax house, 1847. He took it and wrote a paragraph of such oils and sighs that women laughed into their sleeves. He secured a small donation, felt himself virtuous, and went back up north to file the objects. He never noticed the way the museum's bell rang once wrong when he left the room. The attendant, a woman with the good job of dusting what men respect too much, heard it and let it pass. Bells make mistakes when nobody listens. Savannah lived without it. The city had other idols to smash and other rooms to break. But in that house, grown modest where it had been taught vanity, people kept certain habits. When daughters came of the age certain men believed to be their business, mothers taught them the trick of pressing a thumb to the jamb and counting 4, 3, 2. When the bell rang at noon, people did not stop breathing to be fair to anyone. When the door needed setting, somebody reached for the latch and made sure it faced the road. When the left hearthstone got warm, someone said, aloud maybe, decent, and fed the flame. Once, on an evening with a storm out on the river rehearsing its intentions, a daughter of the house, Annabeth's granddaughter, chin more her own than anybody's, stood in the parlor where there was more air than furniture, and said to a friend, "There used to be a portrait that taught this room to behave badly." The friend looked at the blank wall and said, "Then they were obedient to a wall." The granddaughter said, "They were obedient to an idea." The friend said, "Did they fix it?" The granddaughter answered the way a town that has learned a good answer speaks. "We change directions. That's what fixing looks like when you're honest." At dusk, the river bell rang once. Polite, not bossy. The parlor bell answered from far inside, as if to say, "We will eat, not we will be seen." The air moved along the floor. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a man rehearsed his apology for getting home late. Somewhere a woman put her palm to wood and told a room what job it had been hired for. Outside, Spanish Moss took the night respectfully and handed it back in the morning. Inside, the latch faced outward. The house agreed. The river kept its books. The green, if it came up at all, came in leaves, women dried and stewed for respectable reasons. And the space over the mantel, cool, ordinary, generous, held nothing it was not prepared to forgive.